Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. A contributing editor for Vanity Fair magazine, Sebastian Junger is the best-selling author of The Perfect Storm, A Death in Belmont, and Fire. Between June 2007 and June 2008, Mr. Junger embedded with the 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team, making 5 trips to the Korengal, am I pronouncing that correctly?
That's right.
Korengal Valley of eastern Afghanistan, a location that saw more combat than any other in the Afghan theater. Mr. Junger describes what he experienced in his most recent book, War. By the time you decided to make 5 trips to Afghanistan, intentionally seeking danger, you were a successful author and a married man. What were you doing?
I've been reporting on wars since Bosnia in the early 90s, and it really is just how I see myself. The author gig came a little later. It worked out better than I could have anticipated, but it never changed my sense of myself as being a reporter and who goes to foreign countries and often reports on conflict.
All right. Segment 1. You divide war into 3 subsections or 3 books, the first of which is Fear. You quote Captain Dan Carney, commander of Battle Company, quote, this is Dan Carney in your book, "I was blown away by the insurgents' ability to continue fighting despite everything America had to throw at them. It was a different enemy than I fought in Iraq, and the terrain offered some kind of advantage I'd never seen or read or heard about in my entire life," close quote. Young Americans in the Korengal Valley, who was the enemy, and what was distinctive about that terrain?
It was very mountainous. The valley started around 5,000 feet, and it was extremely rugged. There was a lot of rocks, a lot of vegetation, a lot of places to hide. There was something called micro-terrain. It's the military's term for little holes and hiding places in the rocks where you can survive artillery or even 500-pound bombs dropped by planes. So they could completely hammer a Taliban position, and then they would, the smoke would clear and the Taliban would pop up and start shooting again. The Taliban were a mix. Starting at the bottom, there were local guys who were paid $5 to, shoot off a magazine of AK at the Americans and sort of run away. There were those guys, not particularly ideological. It's a poor place, and they needed some money. Sort of going on up the chain, there was a lot of timber cutting in there, and there was a kind of a local timber mafia, and they would cut these huge trees on the upper ridges and export them to Pakistan illegally. Those guys had a kind of vested criminal interest in keeping government authority out of the Korengal Valley. Not ideological, but they saw a sort of common a common goal with the more ideological fighters that came in from Pakistan. There were Pakistanis trained in the training camps in Pakistan. There were foreigners from Saudi Arabia, from Chechnya. Those were really, really hardcore guys. They really knew what they were doing, and they were utterly ideological and probably not people you could really negotiate with.
So you got 3 levels of harassment from ordinary villagers, if that's the term, who live in the area, the local black market syndicate, and then people who were really part of the international war on terror.
Yeah.
Okay. Fear, your topic here in this first book. Quote, "Combat jammed so much adrenaline through your system that fear was rarely an issue. Far more indicative of real courage was how you felt before the big operations. My personal weakness wasn't so much fear as the anticipation of it." Explain that.
One guy said to me, the scariest stuff that happened up there were the things that didn't happen, the attacks we were expecting that didn't happen. Once an attack started, fear really was not a problem. I mean, you were kind of functional, but your mind went kind of blank. At least mine did. The guys were very well trained. They jumped on their weapons and they did what they were trained to do. And fear really was not an issue, but the dread.
They jumped on their weapons. You picked up a pen. You were one of these guys. The book makes clear you lived as they lived with them, with the one unvarying distinction that you never picked up a weapon.
I had a video camera, and I was shooting a documentary in addition to writing this book. And in combat and outside of combat, my job was to shoot video. And the one time that I got caught we got hit pretty hard at this outpost, and I didn't have my camera. I couldn't get to it. There was too much gunfire between me and it. And that was the one time where I really sort of panicked in combat. Otherwise, I had a job to do, and that job kept me from experiencing fear. The dread beforehand, before an expected attack or before an American operation into a dangerous area, that dread was really sometimes kind of unbearable. But it's a sort of different experience from straight fear. I was blown up by an IED. I was in a Humvee that got blown up, and we were stuck in there for a few minutes taking fire. The Humvee was on fire. I had zero fear. I don't think my heart rate even went up. All the fear of that situation happened later in the evening.
Again, another quotation here. The more literal forms of strength, like carrying 160 pounds up a mountain, depend on the size of your muscles, but muscles only do what you tell them. So it still keeps coming back to the human spirit. Close quote. Is that a clue to your motivation and to the theme of this book, that you're drawn to reporting on combat because the human spirit is on most vivid display when the human body is in constant danger? Is that what's going on here?
I mean, that might be kind of a fancy way to put it. I mean, in combat, I think you see the essence of who we are as human beings, the good and the bad. It's all on very sort of vivid display. There was a guy in the platoon we were on a very long patrol, a 24-hour movement. Everyone was exhausted, and one guy started falling out, which is what soldiers call sort of like failing physically. And we were in a very bad place.
Falling out, what he starts to stumble? Or
yeah. Okay. Slow everyone down. And this one guy in the platoon, a guy I was pretty close to, said, you can't be tired. You don't have the right to be tired. And I say in my book, combat is the only situation where you don't have the right to experience something as human as exhaustion. And the reason is that what happens to you happens to everyone. If you slow down, everyone has to slow down. If you don't drink enough water on patrol and you dehydrate and you become a heat casualty, everyone is stuck with you. And so it makes the individual completely accountable to the group. It's not a matter of discipline from above. It's a lateral discipline from your brothers in the platoon. And it's one of the things, being part of a platoon like that and accountable to everyone and with a very clear sense of your job out there, I think is one of the things that men really miss about combat when they come home. It's not so much the adrenaline, it's having that very secure place in a unit where what's expected of you is very, very clear.
Segment 2, the second sub-book in War, Killing. Like the rest of the book, you're mostly concerning yourself here with narrative, with description, with reporting on what you see. But you offer a couple of different ways of understanding the essential activity of combat, killing. Here's one, quote, "War is a lot of things, and it's useless to pretend that exciting isn't one of them. It's insanely exciting. War is supposed to feel bad because undeniably bad things happen in it, but for a 19-year-old at the working end of a 50 cal during a firefight, war is life multiplied by some number that no one has ever heard of." Close quote. So forget rationalizations about why war may be just in certain circumstances. Young men kill other men because it makes them feel so alive. Is that part of what's going on?
No, I think you're reversing the cause and effect a little bit. They're put in these situations for political reasons. They join up maybe because of 9/11 or their father was in the military. War is triggered by political problems. One way or another, the guys find themselves out there. And what happens to them is that the rationale for the war itself disappears in combat. And what remains is the bond between the men. And that bond is intoxicating. To be in a small unit where your job is very clear and you're functioning the way you were trained to do, protecting your brothers in that platoon and they're protecting you, is a situation you cannot recreate in society. It's a very fulfilling one. And it's confusing to these guys because they come back, they come home, and they miss something that is absolutely terrible. It's like missing a really, really bad marriage. And it confuses them, and they don't know what to do with the contradiction.
Here's one sentence I'm going to quote. "The guy who blows us up is 100 feet away behind a rock." Describe that incident.
It was in the winter. The weather was really bad, and I couldn't get on a resupply helicopter. There were no flights, so I was on a supply convoy to get into the Korengal Valley. I was in the second Humvee, and we were blown up by a roadside bomb detonated by a guy 100 feet away behind a rock, hardwired to the explosive. And it went off under the engine block instead of under us, and that spared us injury or worse. And I just, later afterwards, we survived it. There was combat after that. The Humvee caught fire. We got out of it okay, and the soldiers found the wire that he had used to blow us up. And then they found the campfire that had kept him warm all night while he was waiting for the convoy to come into the valley. It was very cold. And then they found the battery he used to trigger the charge. There were all these kind of, we could see his footprints. There were all these kind of human evidence of like a human being just 100 feet away who had tried to kill or maim all of us. And I was just struck by the kind of humanity of the situation and the incredible brutality of it. Like I didn't know him, he didn't know us, and he was trying to do the worst thing possible to us. And we were trying to do the same thing to him. The soldiers were. And
right.
That is one of the tragedies and ironies of war.
You write, killing begins to make a kind of sense to me. A man behind a rock touched 2 wires to a battery and tried to kill me, to kill us. There are other ways to understand what he did, but none of them underrides the raw fact that this man wanted to negate everything I'd ever done in my life or might ever do, close quote. What's so striking there to me in that passage is that killing begins to make a kind of sense, an emotional sense. You understand why the soldiers feel they have no choice but to shoot, to kill when they can, when they're forced to. What do you mean when you say it begins to make sense to you there?
People see killing as a moral choice. And in a situation where your life is in danger, it ceases being a moral choice and becomes a very practical one.
Got it. Final passage from the second sub-book or book of war. Once in a while, you'd forget to think of the enemy as the enemy and would see them for what they were, teenagers up on a hill who got tired and cold just like the Americans. Once you thought about them in those terms, it was hard not to wonder whether the men themselves, not the commanders, but the actual guys behind the guns, couldn't somehow sit down together and work this out, close quote. And what's striking in that passage to me is once in a while. Why isn't this thought haunting the entire experience?
You needed a certain amount of quiet time to get in touch with who the enemy was. When they were shooting at you, it didn't really matter who they were. Someone was trying to kill you. I had bullets hit, inches from my head. I got blown up. Everyone in the platoon was almost killed. And you really needed a week or two without a firefight to start to think, well, there's guys on the next hilltop over who are sort of watching the clouds drift by all day, wondering when we're going to attack them, and we're wondering the same thing. And in the end, it's just guys like us over there. But it took a certain amount of peace and quiet to come to that thought.
Okay.
And it didn't go very far from there.
Segment 3, the third book within war, is entitled simply Love. Quote, the Army has a certain interest in understanding what was going through Junta, am I pronouncing that correct?
Junta, yeah.
Junta. What was going through Junta's mind, because whatever was going through his mind helped save the entire unit from getting killed. Tell that story and then explain why the Army needed to be interested in what was going through his mind.
First platoon walked into an L-shaped ambush at night on the Abiskar and on the Gadigal Ridge. And they were facing massive firepower. The whole first squad was taken out in the first burst. And they in some ways, they all should have died, except that they're so well trained. The only safety in a firefight is shooting more bullets than the other side is and forcing them to get their heads down. And once your head's down, you can't shoot back. And so it's a kind of contest of firepower in those first moments. And what you have to do as a soldier is ignore the fact you could get killed and concentrate on doing your job with whatever weapon you have. And that was what Junta and everyone in that platoon did when they got ambushed. And as a result, they lost 2 guys and several were wounded, but it could have been an absolute catastrophe, and it wasn't. And that was because of the incredible training that these guys have gone through.
When I asked about their allegiance to one another, they said they would unhesitatingly risk their lives for anyone in the platoon or company, but that the sentiment dropped off pretty quickly after that. Again, explain that.
There's a limit to how many people you can affiliate with. within the core group, in the squad and in the platoon, I really think, and this happens regularly in war, there were guys who would have thrown themselves on a hand grenade to save the other guys in their squad. You can't have that kind of feeling, that kind of commitment, that kind of love, basically, for an infinite number of people. The limit seemed to be basically the platoon, extending a little bit. About
Platoon
30,
is how many people?
About 35 guys.
All right. The squad is the smallest unit?
Squad's 9 guys.
All right. Squad,
Yeah.
platoon.
Yeah.
Company is 100 and...
About 150.
Got it.
After the sort of company level, it's pretty abstract. So there was a observation blimp that owned by the 173rd, by the brigade, that was in Asadabad, 20 miles away. It was doing something good. It was watching for enemy movement. It crashed during a thunderstorm. It was a brigade asset. It crashed during a thunderstorm, and when the guys in the platoon heard that, they all broke out in a cheer.
I can see indifference, but why were they cheering?
I don't know. I don't think they knew. It was like someone else's problem.
Okay, the Dunbar number. Tell us who Dunbar was and what the Dunbar number is.
Dunbar studied. He's a researcher who studied the frequency at which certain numbers of people occur in human society. Hunter-gatherer groups, corporate groups. I mean, people gather in groups of a certain size, and those sizes are not random. They if you plot them, they occur in certain clumps. And one of the really common numbers was 30 to 50 people. And that was from studying hunter-gatherer groups in our evolutionary past and also in tribes that are still existing. That's essentially the size of a platoon. The next jump up in group size that's very common in the world is around 150 people. That's a company. And you can sort of look at the way the military, not just the U.S., but many militaries, are divided into units, and you can see essentially our evolutionary origins in the sizes of groups that naturally cluster in different societies around the world.
Okay, so there's a sense you can see in particularly in the last third of the book titled Love, you're trying to understand how these men love each other enough to fight for each other. And one explanation is that in some way they're genetically programmed to.
One of the guys said, look, there are guys in the platoon who straight up hate each other, but we'd all die for each other. In Darwinian terms, that doesn't make much sense. Why would you die for a guy? I mean, dying for your children, maybe
Right.
your spouse, but for a guy you're not related to, another peer who will go on to have children and pass on his DNA, and you're going to die and you won't, it makes no sense. But what researchers have figured out is that in our evolutionary past, those groups of 30 to 50 people, you were related to most of the people in that group. So even if you didn't have your own children, you in a conflict, you were dying to protect your nephews, your cousins, your sisters' kids, and that it actually made sort of Darwinian sense to risk your life, sacrifice your life in protection of the group. So the guys in the platoon, in a kind of genetic heritage, in a sense of genetic heritage, they don't know they're not related to everyone else. They're functioning as if they were, in a way that recaptures much of our evolutionary past.
Let me try two brief quotations from war, which seem to me to get at slightly different things. Here's quotation number 1. Over and over again throughout history, men have chosen to die in battle with their friends rather than flee on their own and survive, number 1. Number 2, the defense of the tribe is an insanely compelling idea. Right? Those are both getting at love, at the attachment to the platoon or squad. But they're doing it in different ways. In that first quotation, you've got men have chosen to die. There's a kind of free will. It seems to me that you impute a kind, you wouldn't use this term, but there's a kind of nobility. There's something very attractive to this to you. And in the second quotation, it's insane. It's genetic programming. It's just a kind of primeval instinct. So which is it?
I think it's both. I mean, I think much of our behavior is derived from our genetic past, and it's further molded by cultural influences. In a firefight, you can hide behind a rock, or you can stand up and return fire and help protect everyone else. If you hide behind a rock, you're probably safer in that firefight. It won't do much for your standing in the platoon, but in that moment, you're probably safer. But over and over again, and I have video of this, guys will stand up and risk getting hit in order to do their job in the platoon and keep everyone safer. And in that sense, they're choosing to participate in a potentially suicidal act in order to safeguard everyone else. And that is a very profound choice that a person makes for the welfare of another person. Putting someone else's welfare above your own, it's at the heart of combat, but ironically, it's also at the heart of much of religious thought. There are real parallels between the two.
Segment 4, the journalist goes to war. You write in War, quote, pure objectivity, difficult enough to achieve while covering a city council meeting, isn't remotely possible in war. Objectivity and honesty are not the same, though, and it is entirely possible to write with honesty about the very personal and distorting experiences of war, close quote. Okay, so objectivity is impossible in war. Somehow you can't mean to suggest that John Burns, the great foreign correspondent for the New York Times, was sending home biased dispatches from Iraq. Do you, or do you?
Well, let's move it back a generation. I don't think the American press corps in World War II was evaluating the Nazi point of view objectively. And I don't think they should have been. I think it is possible to be objective about political considerations. When it comes to the killing of people, I think it's very hard to be objective. And if you are with Iraqi civilians and you're watching civilians get killed by American firepower, I think it's very, very hard to be objective about American foreign policy. Likewise, if you're with American soldiers and watching them get killed and nearly getting killed yourself by the Taliban, you're not going to be objective about the Taliban. The bond that you create with the men you're with is really the least of your problems when it comes to objectivity.
So if you say objectivity is not possible in war, you're saying objectivity does not in some way exist in this book, at least in a kind of trite or formulaic way. So what's the bias here?
Well, one of the things that really interested me was my own emotional reactions, because I felt that they mirrored the emotional reality of the soldiers. I mean, I'm a civilian, I didn't carry a gun, but my reactions were not completely different. So as I became included in this platoon, became friends with these guys, became concerned about them, and they became concerned about me, my level of fear in combat melted. It went away. And I had an insight into how they psychologically dealt with combat. So what I became interested in, I didn't want to deny my emotional connection to these guys. It actually became a topic of great interest because I started to understand in that connection there lay the secret to how people deal with psychologically unmanageable situations. They deal with them and they actually even find some good in them.
Again, quoting from War, we reporters had our own issues. Vietnam was our paradigm, our template for how not to get hoodwinked by the U.S. military, and it exerted such a powerful influence that anything short of implacable cynicism sometimes felt like a sellout. I'd never been censored at all, and once I'd asked a public affairs officer to help me fact-check an article, and he'd answered, sure, but you can't actually show it to me. That would be illegal, close quote. So you just said that during World War II, the American press was not objective in covering the Nazis. And it seems as though you're saying that in Vietnam, they weren't objective in covering Americans. The bias worked the other way. Did you have the sense that in Afghanistan, the press was in some way guiltier of fighting the last war than the generals?
Yeah, I think they were. Not everybody, and not anybody all the time, but I think there was a bit of a feeling of that, and I sensed it in myself. I mean, a public affairs officer would tell me something, and I would watch my brain go, "Oh yeah, right." And there was some manipulation of the facts by the public affairs, as there is, with any corporate endeavor that's trying to put a good face on things. But for the most part, they were pretty straight with me. And it was my cynicism that I actually had to it's tricky. You don't want to be crippled by your own cynicism, but you also don't want to be taken advantage of.
Right.
So the press is it's a difficult balancing act. And the military itself, I think, had their own sort of like assumptions that the press was out to just put a knife in their back. Neither was entirely true, but I think those were a hangover from Vietnam, and I'm hoping with the embed system that will get worked out.
Vietnam was fought by draftees while the rest of the nation was dropping acid. Afghanistan, on the other hand, was being fought by volunteers who more or less respected their commanders and had the gratitude of the vast majority of Americans back home, close quote. All right, you've said already, and you make the point a number of times in the book, that under combat, you don't think about politics. But how important was it to those young men with whom you were embedded that they at some level they did respect the reasons, the political reasons they were there?
You know, they're 19, 20 years old. They're not thinking much about the political reasons that they're there. They might have joined the military because of 9/11. That was the closest they got to political thinking about the war that I saw. The opinion of the public wasn't very relevant to them out there.
Mm-hmm.
It became very relevant when they went home. That was when it became important. Out there, it wasn't. I mean, they would get care packages from anonymous people, and they registered the fact that that was a very generous thing for people to do, and that they had some support back home. But it really became important when they came back or on leave, and they're walking through the airport, and people are coming up to them saying, "Thank you for your service." Or one guy went home on leave, and someone in first class. I mean, he was filthy. He'd come off a combat operation. He was still covered in dirt on a flight from Houston to Portland, I think. And a guy in first class said, "Oh, give me your ticket. I'm going to sit where you're sitting and sit in my seat."
Was it important to them that it was a volunteer army?
The soldiers...
Nobody had been drafted to go to that valley.
No one had been drafted. Everyone in that unit that I was with chose to join the Army. If you want to change oil on Humvees in a rear base and draw a paycheck, you can do that. These guys in the Army, they chose to be in a combat unit. They had to work very hard to get into that unit, and they were very, very proud of it. None of them talked about how, oh, it's too bad there's not a draft. We'd have more guys out here. None of them talked like that.
None of that?
No, zero.
And last question, you said they more or less respected their commanders. You talked to folks at a very senior level. Did you end up respecting the commanders?
Oh, tremendously.
You did?
Yeah, I mean, I was in a very bad place, and I've learned about the U.S. military. They are smart enough that they don't put bad units, bad officers in bad places because they'll get chewed up. They put the best people in there. And so because I was in the Korengal, the officers that I met were just like, oh my God, were they smart.
Really?
They're incredible guys.
Segment 5, our last segment, was Afghanistan. Is Afghanistan worth it? Fighting in the Korengal Valley cost the lives of 42 Americans, hundreds more wounded, and yet last month it was announced that, we're taping this in May, last month it was announced that Americans had withdrawn from the valley. Here you tell a story, gripping, moving, about the fight for the Korengal Valley, and we just surrendered it. How does that revise your opinions of what took place? How do you respond to that?
I mean, every war, I think, has its Hamburger Hill, its Dunkirk. We lost 30,000 men at Dunkirk. It's hard to reconcile that. We still won the war. Every war has its Restrepo, the outpost that I spent off and on a year at. I mean, war is...
And that was eventually overrun.
It
was overrun before you got there, sorry.
Well, it was given up. It was given up.
Right,
they pulled out of the valley. War is incredibly complicated, and it's changing every day, and the strategy changes because the enemy's strategy changes. Before the Americans pulled out of the Korengal, the Taliban, they didn't cease operations, but they were drastically reduced. The amount of fighting in the Korengal dropped tremendously in the previous year. And both sides moved on, and that happens, I think, in every war. I think emotionally it's very hard for the soldiers, but in terms of a strategy, the commanders, I think, are saying, look, we don't have enough men, we don't have enough resources, and the 150 men who are in the Korengal are better used elsewhere.
You write of a Lieutenant Colonel Bill Ostland, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, quote, he had such full-on enthusiasm for what he was doing that when I was around him, I sometimes caught myself feeling bad that there wasn't an endeavor of equivalent magnitude in my own life. It wasn't the war per se that he was so fired up about so much as the whole idea that America was actually over there trying to put Afghanistan back together. Were you responding to his enthusiasm because it was so catching, or were you really responding to the idea that he had of putting Afghanistan back together? In other words, were you at some level on board with the program?
I think both. I mean, I've been going to Afghanistan since 1996. It's a country I really care about tremendously. I was there in the 90s. It was a bloodbath. And if NATO pulls out, it's going to go back to that. And that's a very, very painful thought for me to contemplate.
Bloodbath meaning who's killing whom if we pull out?
There was a civil war in Afghanistan in the 90s that was stopped by the toppling of the Taliban after 9/11. So the level of suffering by the civilian population of Afghanistan now is greatly reduced compared to what it's been for the past 20 years in that country. And, I don't think the Afghans are particularly fond of the Americans who wants to have foreign troops wandering around their country. But I think most of them are pretty terrified of the prospects if the world pulls out. And so out of concern for Afghanistan, I'm kind of on board in that sense because the stakes are very high for the Afghan people that this work. And but just in terms of knowing Bill Ostlund, Colonel Bill Ostlund, he just had such incredible enthusiasm. It was hard not to sort of be awed by it and sort of infected by it.
Sebastian, 2.5 or 3 weeks ago, the man sitting in that chair was Fuad Ajami, Middle East expert at Johns Hopkins University, supporter of the Iraq War. In fact, received a medal from President George W. Bush. Not a supporter of the Afghan war, to my surprise, frankly. I hadn't realized his feelings on that. Point number one that he made is that there is no Afghanistan to put back together. The idea that it was ever a normal country is false. Different regions, different tribes, you got overlays of tribal conflict with this kind of black market that you were talking about earlier, with different, effectively, war chieftains. How do you respond to that? How do you respond to the notion that Lieutenant Colonel Austin was just, there's no country to put back together?
He's totally wrong.
That's wrong?
That's totally wrong. Kabul was the location of the best medical school in all of Asia in the 70s. And before the Soviets came in and destroyed that country and then triggered a civil war that's essentially now still going on, the hippie trail went through Afghanistan. I mean, it was a place that many, many Western visitors went. There are museums, there's ancient monuments that tourists would go to. I mean, it wasn't unified in the sense the United States is unified, but that doesn't mean it was in conflict. It was stable for decades.
It functioned, it was stable.
It functioned. I mean, look, it's a funky place, and that's one of the things that makes it interesting. But
you get funky, hold on, you've got unpack funky for me. What do you mean by a funky place?
Oh, there's tribes and there's nomads and there's all kinds of scenes that look like they're right out of the Bible. If you grew up in Wisconsin, you're going to see, and you go over there, you're going to see things you didn't think you'd ever see.
Okay.
But it was a functioning country, and it was peaceful. It was peaceful enough that people went there in the 60s and 70s regularly. I mean, it was a real tourist destination, and I mean it's sort of adventurous travelers, but people went there. And the Soviet invasion ruined that, and the country is still trying to put itself back together. So, in my opinion, he's completely wrong, and it can be done.
It can. Okay, let me give you one more quotation. This is a direct quotation from Fuad Ajami. Karzai, the president of Afghanistan, is a bandit, and the Afghan campaign can't be won. There's nothing to be gained for the United States in Afghanistan. It just doesn't end well.
I mean, he can't see the future any more than I can or you can. I'm sure there are people.
What kind of ending can you see, though? You must posit some happy ending, or you wouldn't be arguing as you are.
I mean, the Western world figured out how to drive the German army out of Europe. Right? They did D-Day. They pushed through France and pushed the Germans back into Germany. If they can do that, there's something like 10 or 20,000 Taliban fighters essentially barefoot in the mountains with AKs. They can probably figure out how to win that fight. I think the problem isn't a military one in Afghanistan. I think it's a political problem in the countries of Europe and the United States. And if they really want to do it like they did in World War II, they can probably figure it out.
And how does one, I'll let you be the journalist who's just watching it all from the outside, how does one put together the political will to do it?
I mean, I'm not in a position to make recommendations on U.S. foreign policy, but every country in Europe has been attacked or has had a near miss from al-Qaeda. Madrid, London, Holland, Italy, France, all of them were the subjects of plots or actually had attacks. I think what drove the United States into Afghanistan was 3,000 dead in New York City on 9/11. I think if those 3,000 dead had happened in Paris, France would be in Afghanistan. I think the world needs to understand that the chaos and violence of Afghanistan can reach out to touch them in the future, in a year, in 10 years, if that country isn't stabilized. It was a rogue state. It was a perfect refuge for an organization like Al-Qaeda. There were no extradition treaties. They could hide there. There was a lot of income from poppy. It was a perfect training ground for their fighters. And if we go back to the 90s, we may risk going back to 9/11.
Last question. In this book, you're going back, I'm just giving you my feeling as a reader here. You're going back and forth, trying out different theories for explaining the way the men behave as they do. You use the word courage, and then 3 pages later, you're talking about ways in which they might be genetically programmed. Your objective, making sure the reader understands that you had a video camera, not a weapon, you weren't actually part of the unit, and then a moment or two later, it's clear that you're feeling like one of the men. So let me ask you this as a kind of summary statement here. I'm quoting from the book. Heroism is hard to study in soldiers because they invariably claim that they acted like any good soldier would have. Among other things, heroism is a negation of the self. You're prepared to lose your own life for the sake of the others. Close quote. So even though this story takes place in a valley that a month ago the United States gave up on, and even though you're a journalist, do you want to call the men you covered heroes?
Heroes is such a loaded term. The way it's used commonly is really anyone who served. The soldiers themselves draw greater distinctions. Serving on a rear base is very different from serving on a front line, and the soldiers are very aware of those differences. The guys themselves, they wouldn't call themselves heroes, and I don't think I would want to describe them in ways that they don't understand themselves to be. They were very, very brave, and probably their sort of most noble act, I think, was joining in the first place and deciding, look, I didn't serve my country. I've lived my life for myself my entire life. And these guys decided to volunteer, to risk their lives and serve their country. And whether you're for or against the war, that's a noble thing. And I think the real inspiration in this lies in seeing and understanding the profundity of that choice. What happened in the Korengal Valley, they did for themselves. They don't call it courage. And I think that's something that should be respected, you know, the way they describe their own actions. But to join and serve a greater cause, that's a profound thing. And it really, it's something that has affected me a lot to be around.
Sebastian Junger, the author of War, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution. Thanks for joining us.